This is not just about the youngest children in our society, who are, by their very nature, vulnerable. It is also about the many young people and adults.
An unexpected intervention inside Wren House has completely shattered the palace hierarchy. The Duke of Kent, the longest-serving living elder of the bloodline, has issued a definitive private statement. Bypassing Queen Camilla entirely, he has declared the Princess of Wales as the true spiritual and royal successor to the late Queen. This unscripted move has triggered absolute chaos behind closed doors at Buckingham Palace. The quiet humiliation of the current Queen has officially ignited a high-stakes battle for the next reign. The defiance in the drawing room. A single silver signet ring tapped rhythmically against the arm of an upholstered chair inside Wren House late last Thursday afternoon. The quiet residence, tucked away in a secluded corner of the Kensington Palace grounds, was filled with the soft ticking of a grandfather clock. The elderly gentleman sitting in the chair held a small, neatly folded sheet of thick stationery. The Duke of Kent, the longest-serving living male cousin to the late sovereign, did not look out at the manicured lawns. His focus remained entirely on the two senior courtiers standing before his desk. When he spoke, his voice carried the absolute finality of a man who has witnessed 8 decades of constitutional transitions. He handed the paper across the desk, instructing them to deliver it directly to the office of the permanent secretary. The document did not contain standard family pleasantries or routine administrative queries. It was a formal, written position statement concerning the long-term continuity of the crown. The Duke had watched the ongoing shifts within the palace hierarchy with a growing sense of quiet concern. He chose this specific moment to intervene, drafting a declaration that explicitly identified the Princess of Wales as the true spiritual and institutional successor to the late Queen. The intervention bypassed the standard channels of communication completely, sending an immediate shockwave through the administrative offices at Buckingham Palace. This was a calculated move by the ultimate institutional insider. The Duke is not a casual observer of royal politics. He is the living memory of the House of Windsor. He has walked in every state procession, attended every major council meeting, and preserved the strict standards of the old court since the middle of the 20th century. His decision to formalize his views on paper meant that his words could not be ignored or downplayed as mere family gossip. The declaration was an intentional challenge to the current Queen's systematic efforts to position her own inner circle at the absolute center of the modern court. The reaction inside the Central Palace offices was immediate and intensely defensive. A senior advisor to the Queen Consort received a digital transcription of the Duke's letter at 6 o'clock that evening. The advisor went directly to the private apartments, where a scheduled meeting regarding the upcoming charity gala was abruptly abandoned. The staff members present were dismissed without explanation, and the doors to the principal sitting room were locked for the remainder of the evening. The realization that a senior prince of the bloodline had openly questioned the long-term legitimacy of the current reign created an atmosphere of profound panic. The dispute focuses on a fundamental question of institutional identity. The current Queen's team has worked tirelessly to build an independent platform for her, securing prominent international patronages and high-profile media coverage to cement her status as a co-leader of the modern monarchy. They believed that time and public duty had finally neutralized the old controversies of the past. The Duke's letter shattered that illusion in a single day, reminding the entire organization that true structural authority within the British state rests entirely on the direct bloodline and the figures who embody its future permanence. The text of the declaration was remarkably precise in its wording. The Duke emphasized that while the current Queen holds her title by virtue of marriage, the institutional weight of the crown must align with the individuals who represent the next era of the state. He singled out Catherine's quiet dignity, her steadfast adherence to traditional public service, and her deep connection to the late sovereign's model of leadership. The comparison was silent but devastatingly clear, drawing a sharp contrast between the princess's high standing and the shifting, temporary nature of the current Queen's court. The logistics staff now faces an acute dilemma. The Duke's intervention has introduced a major conflict into the planning for the upcoming state opening of Parliament. The seating charts for the Royal Gallery are arranged according to strict rules of historical precedence. But the Duke's letter has requested that a specific group of senior family seats be allocated closer to the heir and his wife. If the planning committee honors the request, it will create a highly visible public statement that diminishes the visual prominence of the Queen's immediate entourage. The internal divisions have begun to impact the daily movements of the household personnel. Aides from the two different camps have stopped sharing information through the standard informal networks, relying instead on formal encrypted emails that create a permanent audit trail. The casual warmth that once existed in the staff dining rooms has been replaced by a rigid, cautious professionalism. Employees are fully aware that a single careless comment could be interpreted as a sign of disloyalty to one of the competing factions. The Duke's perspective is deeply rooted in the historical framework of 1952. As a young man, he witnessed how his cousin ascended the throne and spent decades building a sanctuary of public trust around the crown. He believes that sanctuary was constructed through absolute self-discipline, a quality he views as the defining characteristic of Catherine's public life. By naming her as the true successor, he is attempting to lock in that specific model of royal service before the current administration can implement a more commercial, media-driven approach to the monarchy. The Queen's inner circle has reportedly attempted to organize a private meeting to clarify the situation. A senior emissary from her office phoned Wren House last Friday morning, proposing an informal lunch to discuss the coordination of future joint events. The Duke's private secretary declined the invitation within 10 minutes, stating that his schedule was completely full for the next several months. The abrupt refusal confirmed to insiders that the elder prince has no intention of retreating from his stated position. The conflict has also complicated the management of the royal archives. A project to catalog the late Queen's private diaries and letters from the 70s has been delayed due to a disagreement over access permissions. The Queen's team wanted her personal archivists to oversee the selection of materials for an upcoming biography project. The Duke used his authority as a trustee of the collection to insist that the project remain under the exclusive control of the permanent library staff, ensuring that no modern political considerations could influence the historical record. The sudden assertiveness of the old guard has caught the king's advisors off guard. They had assumed that the older generation of royals would remain passive during the current transition period, focusing their remaining energies on their own localized patronages. Instead, the Duke's action has demonstrated that the traditionalists within the family are willing to deploy their considerable institutional leverage to shape the future narrative of the house. They are playing a long strategic game, focused entirely on the security of the next reign. The Prince of Wales has remained completely detached from the immediate controversy. He has issued no statements and attended no meetings regarding his cousin's letter. However, his close associates note that his office has quietly expanded its coordination with the Duke's staff on a series of upcoming land management initiatives in the western counties. The increased collaboration signals a silent consensus between the current heir and the senior elders of the family, leaving the current Queen's Court increasingly marooned within its own administrative bubble. The document that sparked this internal explosion remains securely filed in the central registry, but its administrative impact continues to widen. The lines have been drawn with an absolute clarity that no amount of public relations spin can erase. The old guard has spoken, anchoring their loyalty firmly to the future princess, and creating a permanent structural barrier against the current queen's ambitions. The battle for the narrative of the monarchy is no longer a hidden undercurrent. It is an active, escalating reality that is transforming the internal structure of the court before the eyes of the entire institution. The Queen Consort's contraction of power. The sound of electric screwdrivers echoed through the long gallery at Buckingham Palace at precisely 7 o'clock on Friday morning. A team of maintenance workers, dressed in standard dark overalls, moved methodically from one gilded panel to the next. Under the direct supervision of an assistant curator, they began removing 3 prominent, heavy portrait frames from the silk-covered walls. These specific oil paintings depicted scenes from the current Queen's early public engagements, following her marriage in 2005. The blank spaces left on the wall exposed the sudden, unannounced contraction of her visual presence within the state apartments, a swift rearrangement of the palace interior that took place without a single explanation to the domestic staff. The physical removal of the artwork was the first visible sign of a major strategic retreat happening within the palace bureaucracy. The administrative offices at Clarence House had spent months planning a comprehensive public relations campaign designed to highlight the Queen's 2 decades of continuous royal service. The campaign was intended to culminate in a series of high-profile state dinners and international tours, securing her position as an indispensable pillar of the current reign. The Duke of Kent's private declaration shattered those plans completely, forcing the Queen's strategic team into a defensive posture as senior courtiers began quietly reallocating resources away from her personal office. A confidential audit of the palace operational budget, leaked to a senior financial controller on Monday afternoon, revealed the financial reality of this power shift. The funding allocations for the Queen's personal communications team were quietly placed under a temporary freeze. The administrative directive, issued from the Treasury Department at Kensington Palace, required all non-essential media expenditures to be submitted for prior approval to a joint committee dominated by the Prince of Wales's advisors. This economic restriction effectively stripped her team of their ability to launch independent public campaigns, locking them into a rigid budget that prioritized the future court over the present one. The tension within the administrative corridors has created a distinct division among the junior staff members. Young press officers, eager to secure their long-term careers within the institution, are increasingly seeking transfers to the teams supporting the Princess of Wales. They recognize that the current Queen's influence is bound strictly to a single timeline, while Catherine represents the permanent future of the state. This silent exodus of talent has left the Queen's personal office severely understaffed, forcing her remaining advisors to take on an exhausting schedule of routine administrative work just to maintain her basic public commitments. The dispute over the portrait frames quickly became a focal point for this internal warfare. The assistant curator who supervised the removal was acting on a written order from the Lord Chamberlain's department, which cited a routine restoration and rotation schedule for the royal collection. However, a senior secretary within the Queen's office discovered that the replacement artwork selected for the gallery consisted entirely of historic portraits of the late Queen Elizabeth II and her sister, Princess Margaret. The deliberate restoration of the direct bloodline's visual history was a silent but undeniable confirmation of the Duke's perspective, effectively pushing the current Queen's modern image back into the shadows of the past. The Queen's chief strategist resigned 48 hours after the paintings were taken down. The departure was announced internally as a planned retirement to spend more time with family. But insiders knew the true cause was a total breakdown in communication between the strategist and the King's personal secretary. The strategist had urged the aggressive public response to the Duke's intervention, proposing a series of exclusive magazine interviews and documentary features to reassert the Queen's personal popularity. The King's office blocked the proposal instantly, fearing that any overt public campaign would expose the deep fractures within the household and invite unwanted media scrutiny during a sensitive political period. The international logistics teams have also begun adjusting their operations to reflect the current Queen's reduced status. Planning for a proposed autumn visit to several European capitals was quietly scaled back last week. The revised itinerary dropped 2 major state receptions where the Queen was meant to deliver keynote addresses on her personal charitable initiatives. Instead, the events were replaced by low-key cultural visits and private meetings, minimizing her visibility on the global stage and ensuring that her appearances remain strictly subordinate to the broader diplomatic objectives of the government. The contraction of power has been particularly noticeable within the charitable sector. For years, prominent national organizations competed for the Queen's personal patronage, viewing her endorsement as a guarantee of high-profile media attention and financial support from wealthy donors. In recent weeks, however, several major foundations have quietly postponed scheduled meetings with her representatives. Board members are increasingly aware that the true focus of royal influence is shifting rapidly toward Kensington Palace, and they prefer to align their long-term fundraising strategies with the interests of the future Queen rather than investing resources in a court that is approaching its twilight. A highly sensitive memo regarding the allocation of royal transport assets circulated among the transport coordinators last Wednesday provided further evidence of the internal squeeze. The document detailed a new priority schedule for the use of the official state vehicles and helicopters, For the first time in the current reign, the Princess of Wales was granted equal priority status to the Queen Consort for all non-state travel within the United Kingdom. This administrative adjustment meant that if a scheduling conflict arose, the Queen's team could be forced to use secondary commercial transport, an unprecedented logistical humiliation that signaled her declining leverage within the family's operational hierarchy. The Queen's private reactions to these systematic cutbacks have been closely guarded by her remaining loyalists. She continues to arrive at her scheduled library openings and military reviews, with her characteristic poise, smiling for the local photographers and fulfilling her duties without any outward sign of distress. But within the walls of her private study at Clarence House, the atmosphere is described by an interior staff member as increasingly isolated. The endless stream of courtiers and politicians who once sought her counsel has slowed to a trickle, leaving her to manage her daily routine with only a handful of long-term personal friends for company. The king's ability to protect his wife's position has been severely compromised by his own ongoing health considerations and the mounting demands of his constitutional duties. He must spend his limited energy on the core functions of statecraft, reviewing cabinet papers, and holding weekly audiences with the Prime Minister. He cannot afford to exhaust his political capital on internal palace squabbles over seating charts and portrait displays. The prince and his traditionalist allies know this, and they have chosen this specific moment of vulnerability to enforce their vision of a streamlined, bloodline-focused monarchy, executing their administrative changes with a ruthless efficiency that leaves the Queen's court with no viable path for retaliation. The physical transformation of the Long Gallery was completed by Friday afternoon. The empty hooks where the Queen's portraits once hung were filled with the historic images of the bloodline princes and princesses from the middle of the last century. Visitors walking through the state apartments now see a seamless narrative of continuity that stretches from the late Queen directly to the next generation, completely erasing the modern compromises that define the current marriage. The visual purge is complete, and the machinery of the court has moved on, locking the new order of precedence into place and leaving the Queen Consort to navigate a rapidly shrinking sphere of influence within her own palace. The bloodline of the late Queen speaks a long, mahogany conference table inside the old committee room at the Privy Council office was covered in leather-bound ledger books late last Tuesday morning. The air in the room was heavy with the scent of old paper and furniture polish. Representatives from the three main royal households sat in absolute silence as a senior constitutional archivist turned the delicate pages of a century-old protocol log. The meeting had been called to settle an acute dispute over the scheduling and hosting rights for the upcoming royal garden parties. Traditionally, the current monarch and his consort hold absolute authority over these historic summer gatherings. However, a formal challenge had been filed by the office of the Duke of Kent, disrupting the standard bureaucratic process and forcing a complete review of the royal precedence guidelines. The dispute was triggered by a specific unpublicized request from Clarence House. The Queen's personal staff had proposed that she should host the prestigious annual reception for the nation's military veterans entirely on her own, without the joint presence of any other senior royals. They viewed the solo appearance as an ideal opportunity to highlight her independent status and reinforce her position as the primary female representative of the current reign. The plan was instantly blocked when the Duke's office issued an explicit reminder to the planning committee, citing a constitutional convention from the reign of King George VI. The Duke's memorandum stated that during periods of transition, major national gatherings involving the armed forces must be hosted by a prince or princess of the direct bloodline or a designated future successor. The intervention was a deliberate and public reassertion of the traditional laws of inheritance. The Duke was not merely debating a calendar date. He was using his immense historical authority to voice the unspoken consensus of the old guard. For decades, the senior cousins of the late Queen had remained silent as the palace worked to rehabilitate the public image of the current Queen. They had accepted the political compromises necessary to maintain institutional stability during the previous transition. But their patience ended when those compromises began to infringe upon the symbolic rights reserved for the permanent line of succession. By insisting on the strict application of historical precedent, the Duke was sending a direct message to the entire court, The ultimate authority of the monarchy rests on the continuity of the bloodline, not on late-in-life marital arrangements. The archivist at the table finally stopped on a page dated 1953. The historical record confirmed the Duke's position, showing that even during the earliest years of the late Queen's reign, the roles of non-bloodline spouses were strictly regulated during state functions. The precedent was clear and binding for the modern committee. The planning team had no choice but to reject the solo hosting proposal from the Queen's office. Instead, they drafted a revised schedule that placed the Princess of Wales at the absolute center of the military reception, ensuring that she would stand alongside her husband to receive the veterans in the gardens of Buckingham Palace. The decision was a profound blow to the prestige of the Queen's court. Her advisors spent the remainder of the afternoon attempting to salvage the situation, proposing that she should at least deliver the opening address to the guests before the arrival of the younger royals. The request was denied by the permanent secretary, who noted that any variation from the standard protocol would create an unnecessary public distraction. The finality of the rejection left the Queen's team with no room to maneuver, forcing them to accept a secondary role at an event they had intended to dominate. The internal fallout from this decision quickly spread through the wider network of royal residences. Staff members at Windsor Castle noticed that a prominent hospitality suite, usually reserved for the Queen's personal guests during the summer race week, had been quietly reassigned to the office of the Prince of Wales. The adjustment was executed by the Master of the Household's department, which cited a need to streamline security arrangements for the younger generation of the family. The sudden loss of the facility meant that the Queen's personal friends and charitable donors had to be accommodated in a smaller, less prestigious viewing area away from the royal enclosure. The Duke's actions have effectively galvanized the traditionalist faction within the palace administration. Long-serving courtiers who spent their careers working under the strict standards of the late Queen have increasingly begun to look toward Kensington Palace for guidance, bypassing the current administration on matters of long-term policy. They view Catherine as the natural spiritual heir to Queen Elizabeth II, frequently contrasting her calm public dignity and flawless adherence to duty with the complicated media-driven history of the current Queen's rise to power. This silent alignment of the old guard has created a powerful institutional barrier against any further expansion of the Queen's official influence. The shift in allegiance is also visible in the management of the royal wardrobe and historic assets. A sensitive dispute arose last week regarding the conservation and display of the historic robes worn during previous coronation ceremonies. The Queen's team wanted to include these items in a special public exhibition celebrating the modern partnerships of the monarchy. The project was halted when a group of senior family trustees, acting on advice from the Duke's office, ruled that the robes could not be modified or moved from their secure vaults without the explicit written consent of the heir to the throne. The intervention was another reminder that the future court holds a permanent veto over the material history of the state. The King's personal staff have found themselves increasingly powerless to reverse this tide of institutional resistance. The sovereign's daily schedule is entirely consumed by the immediate demands of his constitutional role, leaving him with little time or energy to police the bureaucratic skirmishes happening within the household staff. He relies heavily on his senior advisors to maintain order, but those advisors are fully aware that their own positions are temporary. They know that within a few short years, the entire administration will be dismantled to make way for the new reign, and they are reluctant to alienate the future king by fighting losing battles on behalf of the current Queen. The Queen has reportedly responded to these systematic setbacks by further reducing her private interactions with the senior members of the bloodline. The traditional family lunches that once took place during the summer court have been largely abandoned, replaced by brief, formal encounters at mandatory state functions. Her personal circle has contracted to a small group of fiercely loyal childhood friends and close relatives who operate completely outside the palace ecosystem. This self-imposed isolation has protected her from the immediate awkwardness of the palace corridors, but it has also deepened her detachment from the institutional machinery that governs her daily life. The strategic coordination between the Duke's office and Kensington Palace continues to deepen behind closed doors. Every major decision regarding the representation of the bloodline is reviewed by a joint committee of trusted advisors before it is submitted to the central registry. This unified front has effectively neutralized the Queen's ability to implement any independent public relations initiatives, locking her into a highly regulated schedule that leaves her with no voice in the long-term planning for the institution. The mahogany table at the Privy Council office was cleared by mid-afternoon. The ledger books returned to their secure cases in the basement archives. The new schedule for the summer garden parties was finalized and uploaded to the central digital database, its entries standing as a permanent testament to the victory of the traditionalist faction. The bloodline of the late Queen had spoken through the mouth of its longest-serving elder, drawing an unbreakable circle around the future of the crown and leaving the current Queen to navigate a rapidly diminishing role within the historic house she helped to build. A sudden deepening of the palace divide. A secure delivery van pulled up to the diplomatic entrance of Kensington Palace at 10 o'clock last Wednesday morning. Two plainclothes protection officers supervised the unloading of a heavy, climate-controlled transport case bearing the seal of the Royal Collection Trust. Inside the case sat a selection of historic diamond tiaras, including pieces frequently worn by the late Queen Elizabeth II during her early Commonwealth tours. The items had been transferred from the main vaults beneath London without the knowledge or approval of the current Queen's senior dresser. The quiet relocation of these premier crown assets was the result of a discreet administrative order signed by the Lord Chamberlain's office 48 hours earlier. The sudden movement of the jewelry collection sparked an immediate bureaucratic confrontation behind the scenes. A senior wardrobe manager at Clarence House discovered the empty velvet-lined cases during a routine inventory check later that afternoon. When the manager demanded an explanation from the central vault supervisor, they were handed a new copy of the Crown Asset Allocation Guidelines. The revised document stated that during any extended period of institutional transition, historic heirlooms of high national significance would be allocated based on long-term structural utility. In plain terms, the future Queen was being given absolute priority access over the current Queen consort. The administrative warfare quickly escalated into a series of sharp, encrypted email exchanges between the two private offices. The Queen's personal secretary argued that the unilateral transfer violated the traditional conventions of the court, which usually grant the reigning monarch's spouse first choice of the state collection for major diplomatic events. The response from Kensington Palace was brief, formal, and entirely unyielding. The prince's legal advisors pointed out that under the terms of the 2022 financial restructuring, the ultimate authority over the material assets of the Prince of Wales's lineage rests with the heir to the throne. The division between the two courts has now reached a depth that is impacting the basic coordination of state functions. The traditional weekly diary meetings, where representatives from each household sit down to synchronize their public appearances, have been largely abandoned. They have been replaced by a system of formal written notifications passed through the central registry. Aides from the current Queen's team have complained that they are routinely left out of the loop regarding changes to foreign diplomatic receptions, forcing them to scramble at the last minute to adjust her wardrobe and travel arrangements to avoid visual clashes with the Princess of Wales. The tension was particularly visible during the preparations for an upcoming European state dinner. The organizers had originally planned a unified procession where the King and Queen would lead the international guests into the banquet hall, followed closely by the younger generation of the family. Last week, a modified protocol brief was issued by the Grand Master of the household. The new plan required the Prince and Princess of Wales to enter through a separate ceremonial door, positioning them at the opposite head of the banquet table. The visual separation was designed to create two distinct centers of gravity within the room, preventing the current Queen from presenting herself as the sole female leader of the court. The current Queen's advisors have grown increasingly desperate as they watch her institutional leverage evaporate. They realize that without the direct backing of the bloodline elders, her ability to shape the narrative of the reign is virtually non-existent. A small group of her remaining loyalists recently attempted to organize a private media briefing with selected royal correspondents to highlight her ongoing charitable work in the regional counties. The initiative was discovered by the palace press secretary, who immediately canceled the briefings, warning the staff that any unauthorized independent media campaigns would result in immediate disciplinary action under the Civil Service Code. The King's personal secretary has found himself caught in an impossible position between the two factions. he must maintain the appearance of a smoothly functioning state apparatus while managing a deep personal rift that threatens to undermine the daily operations of the household. His attempts to negotiate a compromise over the tiara allocations were entirely rebuffed by both sides. The prince's team refused to return the items to the main vault, while the Queen's office refused to authorize her attendance at several joint charity events until the protocol guidelines were clarified. The resulting impasse has left a permanent stain of awkwardness over the entire summer calendar. The physical separation of the family's operations is now being mirrored in the digital world as well. The communications team at Kensington Palace has quietly launched a new independent online portal to showcase the princess's long-term early childhood development initiatives. The portal features a distinct visual branding that deliberately avoids any reference to the central palace media channels. The move is a clear statement of administrative independence, proving that the future court possesses the resources and the strategic vision to manage its own relationship with the public, completely free from the constraints of the current administration. The standoff over the state jewelry collection remains completely unresolved as the autumn planning cycle begins. The heavy transport cases remain locked inside the secure vaults at Kensington Palace, their contents reserved exclusively for the future Queen's upcoming state appearances. The current Queen's team has been forced to rely on a smaller selection of secondary family heirlooms, a highly visible public reduction in status that cannot be easily hidden from the sharp eyes of royal commentators. The palace divide has deepened into a permanent structural chasm, and the future court is tightening its grip on the symbols of power with every passing day. The new order of precedence locked. In, the heavy brass rollers of a mobile shelving unit clicked into place inside the central registry safe room at Buckingham Palace late last Tuesday afternoon. A senior archivist slid a newly revised administrative binder into the slot marked for state transition protocols. The document contained the finalized structural guidelines for all future public receptions, banquets, and state processions. The signature at the bottom of the directive did not belong to the King's personal secretary. It was signed by the master of the household, acting under a direct recommendation from the senior trustees of the royal family. The new entries granted the Princess of Wales an absolute veto power over the guest lists and protocol arrangements for the upcoming autumn state visitor schedule. The administrative update was the final, devastating resolution to the high-stakes conflict that had paralyzed the palace offices for weeks. The Duke of Kent's initial written intervention had successfully galvanized the traditionalist faction of the court, giving the planning committees the institutional backing they needed to lock in the long-term security of the bloodline. The current Queen's team found themselves completely outmaneuvered by the rapid legalistic changes. Every single one of their previous counter-proposals, including a request to maintain separate, parallel guest lists for regional events, was systematically rejected by the registry lawyers as a violation of historical precedent. The realization that the balance of power had permanently shifted caused an immediate shutdown of independent operations at Clarence House. The Queen's strategic advisors spent the remainder of the week canceling several private planning sessions with international cultural foundations. They recognized that without the ability to dictate protocol terms or control the seating arrangements at major state functions, any independent initiatives would simply be overridden by the future court. The internal network of the household had adjusted itself to the reality of the next reign, while the current one was still very much in progress, leaving the Queen Consort's office in a state of absolute, quiet isolation. The public face of the monarchy continues to function with a rehearsed precision. The official photographs for the upcoming state openings show a family standing in perfect alignment, their expressions neutral and their behavior perfectly synchronized for the waiting cameras. But the administrative records tell the true story of a permanent institutional restructuring. The Duke's sharp defense of the bloodline has successfully drawn an unbreakable circle around the future Queen, ensuring that when the time comes for the ultimate transition, the continuity of the crown will stand completely uncompromised by the past. The high-stakes battle for the future of the British monarchy has concluded with a decisive victory for the traditionalist old guard. The Duke of Kent's bold private declaration has successfully reasserted the authority of the bloodline, locking in the Princess of Wales's position as the true royal successor. and leaving Queen Camilla facing a permanent reduction in her institutional influence. As the palace machinery quietly prepares for the next reign, the power dynamics inside the House of Windsor have changed forever. What is your perspective on this intense struggle for precedence behind closed doors? Was the Duke right to step in and secure the bloodline's future? Or has this confrontation permanently fractured the current court? Share your analytical thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to follow the real, unvarnished history of the modern royal family.